Okay, so to pick up where we left off from Tuesday, and if you watch the old video, you should be in the similar spot. Remember, we talked about lists. We talked about all the different methods you could do on a list. We also talked about the tuple data type. Remember that a tuple uses parentheses where a list uses square brackets. The real difference between a tuple and a list is mutable and immutable. Think of mutable as mutation. So if you are mutable, it can mutate, it can change. Therefore, a list is mutable. A tuple is immutable, meaning we cannot change it. Once it's set, it's set. So we typically use that something like for system settings, maybe configuration settings, things that would not change when you execute the program itself. All right. To convert between the two, which you can do, so you can convert a tuple to a list and a list to a tuple, you just need to use the list function or the tuple function. Note that you take the tuple function, for example, and you pass the list on the inside. Note you must pass in a list. Note you must pass in a list. And hint, wink, wink, the term question. Figure it out. Everybody misses it because they don't put in the list. You must pass in a list. All right. If you're converting a list from a tuple, then you would need to make sure you pass in the tuple inside of here. If you don't put the second set of parentheses, then you are not passing in a tuple. Okay. And then at the end, if I pass in something like a string into a list, hint, this is why it's important that you pass in the parentheses or the square brackets, is at this point, it will create a list out of the string that was provided. All right. And you could also do this with a tuple if for some reason you wanted to do that. Okay. Let's see here. References. This is important with lists. So if I have spam equals 42 and I say cheese is equal to spam, what is cheese now equal to? 42. 42, right? If I say spam is equal to 100, what is spam equal to? 100. 100. Cheese is equal to? 42. 42. Does everybody see how that did not update? Because you didn't list cheese as being in there. Right. So what this has done is you're assigned an ID to a particular value or a variable when it comes up there. So you can reference another variable, but the moment you reference it, it becomes its own, copying that reference that's across there. So at this point, when we created cheese, we copied whatever this value was to spam. But if we update spam later down the road, spam will update, but cheese will not. Okay. This is very similar when you are doing lists. Lists will not work because lists can be changed and therefore lists are mutable, right? So if I say spam is equal to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, cheese is equal to spam, cheese 1 is equal to hello, spam will now have hello, cheese will have hello. Everybody see why that happened? Okay, so up here, 42 is a value, right? But 42 is immutable, meaning it's an integer. We can't change it. You're actually going to reassign it at that point. So if I say spam is equal to 42 and then I say spam is equal to 100, I'm not changing 42. I'm actually completely reassigning the value of spam. All right. When you use this with the list, it is not the same thing. It's actually doing a reference to this list that's inside of there. And because a list can be changed, therefore, when I change spam, it also changed cheese on the inside there. Okay. So if we want to identify that particular variable, we can run the ID function, and the ID would say ID howdy, and it returns some number here, right? And this is Python's ID for that particular value inside the system itself. So if I say bacon equals hello, the ID of bacon is this. If I say bacon plus equals world, then I do the ID of bacon. We'll notice that the ID has changed because it's now a completely different string. Make sense? Okay. Same way with list. If eggs equals cat and dog inside of a list, ID of eggs is this. If I append moose, notice the ID does not change, right? It's still referring to the list that it was before. Yes, the list changed, but the overall list is still a thing within the system. Everybody kind of see how that works? If I say eggs is now equal to bat, rat, cow, that creates a whole new list, which will have a whole new identity. because this is actually assigning this value. The moment you assign, it does not replace, it just completely wipes it and starts a whole new thing. If I modify this using append, insert, whatever else, the idea of that value is still the same. I'm just changing things inside of it. Yeah.
Is that if you use foundation to add another thing to the list, that would still change it? So if you had like eggs plus whatever, that would also change it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Because now you're technically creating a whole new list when you do that. Okay. Let's see here. You can pass references. So we talked about this before when you guys were doing functions. So if I had def egg, some parameter dot append hello. If I had a spam equals this list, I call this eggs function, passing spam to it. Then at that point, spam is going to get appended with hello. When I print spam, it would what? It would add the hello down there at the end because we used append, right? Okay. If you want to copy the entire thing, like copy an entire list, for example, if we had spam as this list, we do the ID of spam as that. If I say cheese and then I do a copy of spam, I should get a different ID out here, right? It's a different entity. However, if I change cheese 1 to 42, spam is going to be ABCD. Cheese will now be A42CD. Notice that it just changed cheese at this point. So we use a module called copy in order to copy lists, but they're going to be two separate IDs at that point. If I modify one or the other, it doesn't update the other one. If I say cheese equals spam, now it's going to update both of them if I make changes in either one of them. That all makes sense? So copy is the module we would use in order to copy a list. If we have a list of lists inside of it, then we need to use deep copy as a function. So you import copy at the top, you do copy.copy, the name of the list, and that creates an entirely separate list, which will match, but they have two different IDs. If I update one, it does not affect the other. And if it is a list inside of lists, then we would use deep copy so that we can make sure it did that. Yeah.
What would happen if you just used copy on a list inside a list? Would just break, or would it like get wrong?
It would adjust and change things inside. A lot of times it doesn't keep the values like you would expect it to. So you want to use deep copy to do those. Okay. This here is going to have you create a program. It's called Conway's Way of Life. It was kind of a game back in the day. That's a good way for you to kind of figure out how these for loops and range and checks all work inside of there. Let's see here. Let's get past that one. It's a pretty big program, so it's a good way for you to get familiar with everything. And then that takes us to a summary on this side. You got your practice questions here. This comma code used to be a homework assignment, right? And so I don't have it as a homework assignment anymore, but we're going to try to run through that today to see if we can recreate what this wants. You could also do this coin flips experiment or even this picture grid, which deals with coordinates, right? And you can kind of build out a grid to show up on the screen. So let's take a look just as an example here. Idle. Let's create a new file. And let's take a look at this comma code and see if we can build out this code together. All right, so we have this list, spam equals apples, bananas, tofu, cats, right? We want to write a function that will take a list value as an argument and return a string with all the items separated by a comma and a space with the word and inserted before the last item. For example, passing the previous spam list to the function apples, bananas, tofus, and cats should be the result, right? But your function should be able to work with any list value that's passed to it, and be sure to test the case where an empty list comes into your function and it responds in there. All right. So what's the first thing that we can do to set this part up? What's the first three words? Yep. Write a function, right? So to write a function, we need to start a function name, and we could say print list, for example, whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. It says it must take in a list value as an argument and then return a string. So we need to be able to pass in some kind of list into this in here. So let's just call it my list. All right. Colon, we're going to do some code here, whatever that may be. And at the end, we are not to print this list. We are to what?
I know you're expecting us to answer, but like.
I just expect you to read the first sentence of what the project is.
Oh. Well,
Can anybody read the first
Here,
sentence?
write a function that takes a list of values as an argument and
Returns a string. All right.
Yeah.
So that's the result here is we're not printing. We're just returning a string. So we should return some string. Okay. We never actually print this out to the screen. We just need a function that returns some string. Now, we may call this function to test it, make sure it works like we want to. So let's do that. We would call print list. And we would need to pass in some kind of list into this. In this case, we already have one defined. Let's use spam for the time being. And it would go through there, right? Now, what's that do? That returns a string. So we would need to pass this into the print function to actually print it out for us. All right. This is not meant to be printed. It's just meant to return a modified string. And so if we run this, we should get what? Anybody know what we would get with our code here?
Get stuff back.
Should get some string not defined, right? Because we're returning some string. There's no such thing as some string, so we would start off empty. So let's start with some string is equal to an empty string. And then let's go ahead and run this code. There we go. String's empty. It's going to print that empty string. Nothing happens. We're good to go. So this is your basic structure for what this is asking for. All right. The goal is to take a string, and we're going to be taking each one of these variables that are inside of there. And once it reaches the last one, we need to inject the word and then put the last one in there. Does anybody have any ideas what we could do for this? Learning the stuff that you learned Tuesday. For loop sounds good. That's a good start. So let's say for item in my list, right? What are we going to do with that item when we get it? So the first time item will end up being equal to what in this example? Apples, right? So what we want to do is take apples and add it to some string. So how do we do that? Yep, you could concatenate it. Does anybody remember the shorthand way of doing it? You would append to a list. If we were doing a new list, we want to take a string. So how do we add to a string? You're right in the concatenation, but what was the trick that we learned? Before, you guys would do something like some string, what?
Plus.
It'd be equals some string plus whatever item is, right?
Insert.
Those would be to a list. We're working with the string. You guys are all on the right page, but we're just right now we're going to work with some string because it's supposed to return a string, not a list. Right? Yeah, plus equals. So we could do this, or we could take what we learned the other day and do something with plus equals item. And what that's going to do is take this string and then add item to it. It'll rotate through each one of these and then spit out one long string, print it out here. So let's see what that does so far. Okay. What are we missing on this part? Comma space, right? Because it wanted a comma separated value. This is our end goal right here. So we are trying to work and write a function that would return this. So what would we need to add here in order to make that happen? We're adding item. What else do we need to add? Yeah, comma space, right? So let's make that instead of our bracket plus comma space. And now if we run that, we at least have a comma separated one, right? But what's the problem with that string? We don't have and yet, and we have a comma after cats. So how do we stop it doing the comma after cats? And remember, cats is the last one in the list. So what's special about the last thing in a list?
Oh, up to and including, right? Or up to, but not.
What was that part?
It's -1 in the list.
-1 in the list, right? So we could do a check to see if we are at the last one in the list or if it's -1 in the list, right? So how would we write something like that? Because if it ends up being the last one in the list, then we know not to do this part. Yep. Everybody see what that's doing? So we're checking to see if item is the same thing as equal to my list -1, which tells it's the last thing in the list, right? There's a couple ways to go around this. You could go do the length of my list and find out if it's equal to 3 in this case or whatever in there, right? There's a couple different ways to check it. -1 also works in there. We could also take the item and go grab the index of item and see if index equals the last number in the list. A couple different ways to check it. So in this case, if it equals -1, what do we want to do? Well, we don't want to do the comma part, right? We want to print and before it and not print the comma, right? It's a different string that we're going to add. So let's do the else, right? And that'll be our string that we had before. Now we need some version of this, but it should have and it should not do the comma at the end. So what would that look like? Okay. Put and before that, right? We probably want a space there too in order to meet that structure. Does everybody see how we came up with that one? Our goal is to find out whether or not we hit the last thing in the list. And we don't want to say equal to cats, right? Because we're supposed to support any list. Doesn't matter what list we pass. So we're going to check the item that we're going through. Is that equal to the last one in whatever list that we passed in? If it is, do and space and then whatever the item is. If it's not equal to the last one, then we want to do our regular, take the item, do a comma, space, and continue on. In the end, we return it, and then we print it. No, this is for debug purposes only. We'll need to remove that if this was a homework assignment, right? So let's run. We get our result. Everybody see how we kind of got there? So the things that we learned out of this module, I'm going to take this part out, is we know we have a string and we can augment an empty string by just adding pieces to that string, right? That's what we're doing here. We're using string concatenation to add a specialized string back to this some string that starts off empty. We're going to loop through our list. And once we recognize that we are at the last item in the list, we're going to do something different when we add it. Okay. If we look over here, your function should be able to work with any list value that's passed to it. Okay. So if I change this to dogs and I change this to strawberries and that to steak and Ohio. Nobody got that joke. That's okay. We'll let that one slide. I figured Spencer would at least chuckle. Thank you, Spencer.
Yeah, I'm cool, man.
All right. And then let's throw an extra one in here, rabbits, right? So it's not the same count. Let's run. And it looks like it's going to do everything we want it to do, right?
Was that Twin Peaks, Jeff?
No.
No. Okay.
All right. With that, we could remove this. And then last but not least, be sure to test if there is a case where the empty list is passed to your function. So how can we do a check here that we do something? That way, if we pass an empty list, it doesn't break something. Right? We could do a test here. Let's undo what I just did so that we could test it. Instead of spam, we could say some list. And so some list up here that is empty. Let's run that. Nothing happens. So how could we check to see if that list is empty? And if so, tell the user the list is empty.
So, blank.
Sounds like a good idea. Where would we put that?
Yeah, set for loop.
Yeah, we would want to do it probably first thing, right? Before any other code's executed, let's see if the len is 0. So if my list, and in this case, you said use the len function. If the len of my list equals what? Could be none. It could be, can't be none, right? Because we would get a value back out of the len function. It'd be 0, right? And if it's 0, we just take all this code, tab it over, which it won't let me tab. I'll have to do that by hand. Doesn't let me tab that.
Your length of my list is not capitalized.
In print list, but not in this one, my list. Yep, good catch though, because that would make a difference. So down here, when I call that function print list, it would have to match whatever this is up here. So if it's 0, we do that. If it ends up being 0, what should we do? There's something wrong with this code here. Yeah, right. We're checking to see if it's equal to 0. If it's 0, we don't want to run this code. We want the opposite of that. So what should we do here? We could either end it right then and there, or we could say if it's not 0, do this, do else, and in this case, return list is empty, something like that. Some kind of empty string. And that would do that. We could do the opposite of this, where this is 0. We then tell it to do that. The else is everything else, right? Either way is acceptable. It doesn't matter how you want to write it. We'll go with this direction. And so if we run this part where we're trying to run some list, we should get the list is empty. Okay. What happens if I just have one item in my list? And I try to run that. I'm going to get and Jason, right? Well, that wouldn't make sense as to what's coming back there. So how would I write a check to see if it's just a value of 1? Yep. What would we do over here on our if chain? Elif, right? Now, the only difference is we would want to write it the other direction now, because even if it's just a value of 1 or 0, we could do this, or we could write it over here. Either way we want to do it. So elif the len of my list equals 1, then we would just do what? Yeah, we could just return whatever that value is. So return item in this case, right? In this case, we don't have item. What would we return? We could return my list, but that will return a,
Didn't you just return the span?
mm-mm. The only variable we have is my list. You're on the right track. We would return my list. The problem is that would return a list with one thing in it. How do we extract just the one thing that's in the list? There you go. We would just return the first thing in the list because there's only one thing in the list anyway. And then on this case, we would go ahead and do an else and return list is empty. So let's check that. And in that case, here, I got an and Jason. So why would and Jason happen when I passed it some list up here?
It's the last thing on your list.
Yep. So we would have to do a check here. That would do this one check first in order to come back, right? Or we could say if it's equal to 0, then let's do the return list is empty. Elif, then we could do this check. And then if that doesn't work, go ahead and do everything else that we were going to do, right? Or you could move this 1 first, then do the 0, then do the nothing check. In other words, you got to remember that the chain in which you do your if and elif stuff matters. The order that you do that in matters. So in this case, we're going to check right away if it's equal to 0. If it is, do this. If it's equal to 1, do this. If it's anything else, go ahead and do this code. So let's run that. There we go. Now we got the one item out of the list, and this is a string, not the actual list. If we empty that, we got back to list is empty. And if we pass it in a list that has a bunch of stuff like spam is right now, it displays everything doing a and space and the last item. Okay. So very simple little project, but there was a lot of little pieces to work out. This is exactly what you guys are going to have to do on your midterm projects, right? You guys are going to need it to get some form output or whatever you're doing. You're going to have to go through this logical process in order to get that output. If you guys noticed, how did I attack this project? Piece by piece, right? Do little pieces at a time, make your little mini accomplishments, then start making little tweaks in the code. Then make the next little tweak in the code.
Make sure one thing works, then just move on to the next.
Exactly. So if I was to translate this over to items to do, the first one would be 1, define a function, right? That's the first thing it says to do, and return a string. Okay. I'm going to put this down here and all right. What's the next thing we needed to do? This function in particular needed to take a list, right?
Yeah.
And then returns a string in there. So the first thing we could do is just now create some list 3, print the result of the function by calling it with a list. And that got you the first step of what everything we did, right? It just dumped everything into one set. Then we needed to create an empty string. From the empty string, we took a for loop to add each item from list to string using what? Does anybody remember what that was? Where you add 2 strings together?
Oh, concatenation.
String concatenation. Using, in this case, we use an augmented operator. D plus equals, right? Then once we did that, then we had to go back and find out how do we get the last item in the list. So find last item with an if statement and change from comma space to and space, and then the item. Okay. Once we got all that done, write a check for empty list. And then we also wrote a check for one item. All right. So roughly that took about 8 steps in order to take this paragraph into something that we're looking at in Zoo. Okay. Break it down in little pieces in the code. It'll be a whole lot easier for you to kind of chunk it out. Anybody have any questions on how we did this project? The key thing people used to mess up on this homework assignment. One, it has to be a function, right? It asked you to define a function, so you actually need to write a function. I say this because when you get to homework assignment 3, and I say write a function that returns, I should have something that is def blah, 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 return blah, 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 not print blah, 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 right? 2 different things that it's expecting. I don't want you to print something and then return nothing. I want you just to return some string coming back. Now I could use some other variable name besides my string and my list and some string, etc. Yep.
Couldn't you just reuse this code for that assignment?
No,
No.
definitely not for that one because it is a whole lot more complicated. The structure you could do it. I mean, it's going to be a similar structure, but. And the difference in assignment 3 is I don't tell you to just come up with something on your own. It's a very, you do this with this code. So homework 1 and 2, you guys kind of created whatever whimsical thing you came up with. Homework 3 and 4 has very specific, you have this set of data. How do I write a function that pulls from that set of data to this? Okay. That's not due this week, by the way. That's a ways yet. After midterm. All right. So if we go back and look at this week, you guys should know lists. Remember that everything inside of a list is called a what? What is this value inside of a list called?
Oh, string.
Nope.
No.
There's a particular name for this thing inside of a list. Each one of these are what of a list?
ID.
No. We called it in our code. What? Item, right? Anything when you're inside of a list, each one of these are called items inside of the list. All right. This one, this item happens to have the value of a string that's inside of there, and it represents a ordered list. A string is a ordered list that goes through there. And therefore, this is referenced as a index, which you were saying. And that index of cat is what? 0, right? So we start at 0 and we work our way to the right. So 0, 1, 2, 3. This is what most people get confused on because they forget everything starts at 0 for items, or in this case, indexes. Elephant has a special index, which is also what? -1. And so if we wanted to count from right to left, we would have -1, -2, -3, -4.
What is, so if it goes, if you want to go backward, it's negative.
Yeah, if you want to go from the right to the left, it's negative.
Okay, all right.
Yep. That's the reason we checked for -1 here, so that we always grab the last one in the list. Yeah, if you look at this string here, what this is it's gonna, the first time around the for loop, the item is equal to cat, is cat equal to, and this translates down to elephant. Cat doesn't equal elephant, therefore it goes on through. Right. In this case, it's always the last one. So item is the one that's constantly changing as it goes through. Once it says elephant equals elephant, you're good to go. All right. We talked about negative indexes. We can use slices in order to pull out a list of inner items out of a list, right? We can use the len function to calculate the length. If I want to change the values inside of a list using index, what method do I use? So in other words, I want to change the variable in index number 2. How do I do that? Append puts it where? At the end, right? So if I specifically want to go into index 2, I would use which method?
That equals thing in the bracket.
If there's already something in index 2, right? So if I have, for example, here, I want to change index 1 to be something other than strawberries, then yes, I would say spam what? How would I change strawberries here? To say pineapple. I would say spam is the name of my list, right?
Insert.
You're back to the other one I was talking about, but yes, you're right. So if I want to change strawberries, I would say spam 1, right, equals pineapple. Right? That changes this variable. If I want to put something in front of strawberries, then I would use the insert method. And I would have to feed it what number? 1, and then I pass it whatever I want, right? So it would be something like pineapple. That goes to index 1 and injects it in that spot so that strawberries now becomes index 2, right? It's not a trick question. All right, so insert will put it where you know what index you want to insert it in. Append always puts it to the end. If I want to delete something out of this list, knowing the index, what would I say here? So say I want to delete steak.
You said you know the index.
Right. I just know the index. I don't know the value that's inside. Delete, right? So I would have delete. And I'm wanting to remove the 2 index. Spam 2, right? If I knew it's steak and I wanted to remove steak out of my list, it would look like what? Yep. Spam.remove. And I particularly just want to remove the steak out of the list. Okay. The difference between those is one, I know the index. The other one, I know the actual value of that index that I want to remove. What happens if I want to find the index of steak so that I could use the delete statement? How would I do that? I want to know what index steak is so that I could remove use the delete statement. So pretend like I don't know this. I want to be able to use the delete statement to remove steak. How do I figure out what index steak is? There's a method for that.
Print and capture.
Nope.
Scrolling up through the code and looking.
There's a method that I would use in order to find the index. The index method, right? You guys overthink this way too
It's
much.
referencing, right?
It's index. And then we pass whatever variable that we want to find the index for.
Okay.
That will return what?
That'll return you the number it is, right?
2, right? And then at that point, I could then put that into our other function. So if I said del spam square bracket, the spam index of steak, that would also remove it.
I think you're breaking your brains right now.
That's how you know the individual methods. If you want to figure out the index, this is what you would use. All right. Let's see. You guys pretty much went through the rest of them. I'm trying to think of anything else we did. You have the option of in and not in, right? So if I wanted to check to see if steak was in this list, I could then do a if statement, if steak in spam, then it would do something, right? Or I could do the option of not in and be able to check if something is inside of a list. If I wanted to print the spot of where that particular value is plus the value, right, we would have to do some magic in order to figure out what the current value is in order to pull that out. We have this special function called enumerate that would do that for us. So for example, if we had this list of supplies, if I wanted to print it in this fashion, I could just use enumerate, which enumerate gives me a tuple back where the first value is the index number, the second value is the item of whatever was inside. Therefore, we would use this here. Does anybody remember what this is called? Where we're assigning values to a tuple or some result of that, so that we don't have to define each individual value in the list. So for example, say I had a list that looked like this.
Is that reference?
Say I have something that looks like person, and that list has Jason, it has blonde. Nope. And I have blue, and I have 6. All right. That first value is my what? Or this first value is what?
-1.
Right, but what is this? It's a name, right? All right. So if I wanted to say name equals person 0, right? And then blonde would be hair color, right? So hair equals person 1. And what would be blue? Eye color. So person 2 and 6. You think I'm 6, man? I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Maybe something like height. So height is person 3. Okay. If instead of me having to type all this out to assign these values, how could I assign these names to those individual values and do this all in one line? Does anybody remember what that's called? What's that? Louder. Use a method? No. Is that what you said? Yep. There's a specific quote trick that we can use in order to do this all in one line. Does anybody remember what that was? So if I'm assigning these values in beside here and I have multiple of these, and it's a trick, I just said the 3 words for the thing inside there. It's the multiple assignment trick. All right. To do the multiple assignment trick, I list those values that we are the names of what we want to call those values. So hair, eye, and height equal to the list that I'm wanting to do, person. Okay. And what that's going to do is take and do exactly this here, where it takes the first value of that list, assigns the name, the second value assigns it to hair, blue becomes eye, 6 becomes height. And the idea is I no longer have to do this. All right.
If there was another item on the list,
it would fail. We would get an error because we are not, it would say there's nothing for that value to assign on that part. So you have to make sure when you do this, that the number of these match the same number as this up here. All right. If I take height and I move it here, and I take person 2 and I move it here, does that change anything? No, right? Don't let that trick you on the midterm exam. Okay.
But that name here, I height equal person, that takes the place of the.
All of this up here. But if I give you this and I say, give me the order of what this should be down here, does this really matter up here at what order these are in? In other words, that's not the same as eye, name, height, hair, right? This number is what matters because that has to match up with the particular index inside of here. So if I give these to you out of order, doesn't matter. Go put them back in order inside your mind, right? Go here, put that one there, grab this one, go back to here. Now you can go ahead and list these out in the proper order of name, hair, height, eye height. Okay. We can use the random module using random.choice to randomly grab one of these out of here. We can use random shuffle to shuffle everything inside of that list. So some of you guys that were looking at like dice games or something like that, and you wanted a random number, you could use random int, right? But say it's a 6-sided die and you wanted to have different names for the die. You could put those random names in here, have 6 different ones, have it randomly shuffle it 3 or 4 times, then have it do a random choice out of there. And you would make sure you got a random result.
Say you want to do that with like a 100-sided die. Is there a quick way to make a list from 1 to 100?
Or just do random.
Just the number 1 to 100.
Yeah, wouldn't that be like?
What would that look like? We have a function that would
It'd be
immediately
the
create a
thing
list.
Where it counts it from 1 comma, like you want to do 101 because it's up to not including, right?
Right, but what function would we use to create that?
I don't know.
So 100 die equals, wouldn't be random. That would give us a random number. He's wanting to, you could do that. You could just get a random number because it's 1 to 100, right?
Yeah.
And you could do an integer. But how could we create a list with 1, 2, 3, 4? There's a function that we learned early on that would give us that range, right?
Yeah.
So range and the result of range is a list is what it ends up being. So we would say 1,
101.
101, and that would give us back that list. And if we just say print 100 die, it should give us back a list. Now maybe a list like object, we'll figure that out. Oh, why did this fail? Yeah, you can't start with a number, right? We could do die 100.
Okay.
But that didn't give us a list, did it?
No, it didn't.
So it gives us a list like object that comes out of there. What we would want to do is actually fully convert that to a list by running it through the list function. Now we have a list. Okay. Range creates a list like object, but in order to actually make it a list so that we could treat it like a list, we have to pass that into the list function, in which case it will automatically create a list for us from 1 to 100. It's a whole lot easier than you guys actually typing it out, right? All right. Let's see. We talked about the augmented stuff. There's a lot of methods. You guys already went through all of those examples. If I wanted to, we talk about remove, so we're good there. We can use sort. Remember that when we do that, we would say something like spam.sort. That's going to sort it how by default? Alphabetical and capital first or lowercase first? Lowercase first, right? ASCII-betical is what it's called. So it's going to do what?
It's gonna do it.
Or if they say
Capitalize the word it comes before the dot.
You got it, right? So I'm highlighting this exactly what you're looking for. Capitals come first, not lowercase. If you wanted to go the other way around, then you have to do key.st lower, in which case it will then do lowercase first, then uppercase. Okay. So you're passing the key that you want it to use. Now, this str lower, we're going to learn a little bit about that here in coming weeks, what that actually does for us. But for now, you can do that. If I want it in reverse, there's 2 ways for me to do reverse. I can do reverse equals true, right? Or I could just say dot reverse. Either one is going to give me the reverse side of it. Okay. Let's see here. For loops, we already learned that. Do we ever print on our midterm projects? Do we ever just print a list? No, right? Jason's going to count off on that. What should we do instead of just printing or dumping a list to the screen? Not return, but in other words, on your homework assignment or on your midterm projects, I should never see something like
Don't
this
do
on the
that.
screen. Don't do this. What would you do? It's really simple. Yeah, just
Oh.
do a for loop and print out each individual one on its own line, right? That makes it nice and clean out to the user. So for this one, instead of just printing this out, we would simply say for item in die 100, print item. And then it would go ahead and print it out in a nice clean list going down. Okay. Now you may want to do better formatting and actually explain what that item is or whatever else. But the goal is that you shouldn't be dumping lists to the screen for a user. You like, for example, if you had options left, right, up, down, because you're doing a travel adventure game, you wouldn't just print that in square brackets going around. You would actually say, here are your options, left, right, up, down, that kind of thing. Meaning if you had a moves equals up, down, left, right, something like that, right? These are all the options that you want them to be able to have. You wouldn't say print, pick an option. Yep, thank you. Right, and then we would say something like print move. This wouldn't be good in a homework project. In other words, I don't want to see this list get dumped to the screen. Instead, you would say something more like for option in moves, print option. And then when you did that, it would look nice and clean when it got printed out over here on the side. Make sense? You could tab it, you could format it a little bit, make it look pretty. If you don't want them all on their own individual line and you want it comma separated, how could we do that? Yep, we could change the sep here to what? Comma space, right? And if we run that, it would do that. Now the problem is we're not actually creating a string at that point, right? So it's not wrong. It's just there's only one thing in the item, and that's why it's doing it that way. We would want to print moves in this case would be one way to do it. In which case we tell it to print the list, but we want to comma separate all those values. Right? That's going to end up printing the wrong thing out there. So to do the separation of that, it comes back to kind of what we did down here. You would create this string and then tell it to add it to the string and then print it out accordingly. The only difference is you're going to have something like this here, right? And not have to ever do the and unless you guys didn't want to do the and. At the end of the day, the goal is don't dump it straight to the screen. Make it nice and pretty when you format it out. You can do that for debugging purposes. That's fine. But by the time you guys submit your homework projects or your midterm projects, at that point, you take all the debugging stuff out, or you can leave it in, just comment it out. So like this one, for example, we would just comment it out before we submitted it. That's perfectly fine. It's there for debugging, but it doesn't actually execute that code. If it executes the code, now it doesn't match the homework assignment because it never said to print it out, right? We go back to the homework assignment. Nowhere in here did it ever say print it out to the screen. It just wanted a function that returned. And yes, I know that sounds very particular. Python is what? Very particular, right? So, okay. Anybody got any question on lists?
I have a lot of questions, but I have a video I can go back and watch.
There you go. All right, I'll stop this recording.